Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Differences in Culture, from the course on international business. Let's go ahead and get started. This is one of my most favorite chapters. I think that culture and cultural understanding is just so vital in the business community. So often when there's a disagreement, I will very often ask, where are they from, or what's their background, or maybe there was a misunderstanding when it came to culture. So let's go ahead and jump into it and go through the learning objectives, what we're going to understand and learn by the time we get finished with Chapter 4. So first, we're going to explain what is meant by the culture of society. Not so easy to explain, but the book will give it a couple of options. Then we're going to identify the forces that lead to differences in social culture. We'll identify the business and economic implications of differences in culture. That's what I was talking about. I think so interesting. We'll recognize how differences in social culture influence values in business. And then lastly, we'll demonstrate an appreciation for the economic and business applications of cultural change. Because as we'll quickly see, that culture actually does change even over a decade or two. So the opening case, so I'm not sure why it's misreading here, but you get the idea, right? That Westerners often have a difficulty understanding Russian culture, which differs in important ways from Anglo-Saxon traditions. That the Russian culture reflects the founding of Kiev Rus, right, which is also back to that Eastern Orthodox religion, and the Vikings and the invaders that were happening back in 882. Those ideas still exist today. There's an acceptance of unequal distribution of power, conformity, and community are valued over individualism, and avoidance of uncertainty. And I think that these are really important to understand because this, unequal distribution of power, as Westerners, we often criticize or wonder how Putin can be in power and have all of these oligarchs that have so much money and then have this immense poverty within one nation. But for many of those people, they just accept this. They also value the community. They're very, proud as Russians. They, this comes from the ideas that when life was centered on agriculture, and there were agricultural communes, and everybody participated as just one person in that commune, not necessarily as one landowner. They all own the land together. And this avoidance of uncertainty, I think, is also interesting because it can be threatening sometimes when the Western society will be unclear or not particularly precise. And the Russians very much like to make sure they understand exactly what's going on. And that the author, right, throws in many times during the chapter the cynicism that Russians will often have, and the lack of smiles, right? That here I'm already smiling about smiling, that Americans, we will smile even if things are not funny. It's our natural way of looking. But for Russians, they feel that maybe we're laughing at them when we're smiling. So there's a tendency to avoid uncertainty to make Russians less innovative and entrepreneurial than the West. Thus, the culture of Russia may have an impact on the business environment. So this is the first time we're seeing in this culture, Freudian slip, first time we're seeing in this chapter, how the culture can have a big influence on how business works and how business moves forward within an organization, within a country. So the impact of culture starts to talk about cross-cultural literacy. This is an understanding of how cultural differences across and within nations can affect the way business is practiced. And I'll say many times, right, that when I studied my MBA, this chapter was broken into a whole course that we had to take. Really important when we study international business is really understanding cross-cultural communications and the importance of understanding people who don't come from your particular culture. There can be relationships between culture and the cost of doing business in a country, right? So as the chapter says, right, that cultural issues can be helped or hurt in development, and that it can help development of a society, of an economy. And the example here that they give is in the UK, how even in the 1950s and 60s, there was still a clash between laborers and managers. There was a class difference. And so there were a lot of riots. There was a lot of, infighting within the UK, and that other societies like Switzerland, for example, or Sweden or Finland, don't have that difference between laborers and managers. And so they were able to move forward a little bit more quickly, because they didn't have that infighting. Thankfully, a couple of decades later now, the UK, the culture has changed. As I mentioned, that culture can change, and that we don't have that as much, right? Obviously, we see with Meghan Markle, right, marrying one of the princes from England, that we're really closing the gap between the different classes within the UK. Culture is not static, right? As I just said, it evolves, and multinational enterprises can be engines of cultural change too. So that's also, I feel, where us as business leaders, we have such power and influence many times, as we see like in Asian countries with the introduction of McDonald's, right? Fast food has kind of a negative connotation, but there are good things about fast food, right? And there's definitely a sense of quality that comes from fast food, and a new cultural, the idea of a sandwich, the idea of a smoothie, etc., coffee to go, etc. That is what McDonald's and Starbucks have brought and changed the culture within a lot of these different countries. So, and before we hop on to the next slide, also know that culture, as you know, can exist in organizations as well as in families too, right? Each family has their own different culture. When I was at Pepperdine, I taught people and business culture, organizational behavior. And so obviously I'm passionate about how things are done around here. So let's move into the next slide, because that is where we start to define what is culture. And that is definitely a loaded question. When I discuss it with my other professor colleagues and people that I've known for a long, long time, professors in strategy, professors in organizational behavior, professors in international business, still we can't really agree on truly what is culture. So as we said, scholars have not agreed on a simple definition, but today we're going to agree. We're going to talk about one definition that will work for us for this chapter and for this course. It's a system of values and norms shared among a group of people, and when taken together constitute a design for living. This was also a definition that showed up when we talk about Hofstede. We'll talk about him later in this chapter. And he was kind of a real leader when it came to international business and identifying, creating a certain model that kind of helped decipher the different types of cultures around the world. There was also a scholar named Weber who contributed to this definition. But in any case, that's what we're going with right now. Society is a group of people sharing a common set of values and norms. And as I said, when I started this slide, right, the kind of colloquial way of talking about culture is how we do things around here. One of my favorites. So first is the values. These are ideas about what a group believes to be good, right, and desirable. This is really the bedrock of culture. What are the values of the group? And these things are talking about freedom, truth, responsibility, etc. Then we also talk about norms, which are the social rules that govern the actions of the people toward one another. And these are broken into folkways and mores. So as I said, there's so much depth when we talk about culture and cross-cultural communication. You could do a whole PhD in this, and you could become a consultant in cross-cultural communication if you wanted to, like many of my colleagues from Thunderbird. So let's first talk about folkways. These are routine conventions of everyday life. These are dress code, attitude towards time, more less formal things. But then mores are norms that are central to the functioning of a society and its social life. This is more things around theft, cannibalism, views on alcohol, views on adultery. So more about rules And as you can see that things like this can differ, right? Obviously, most of the world, or nobody really is for cannibalism at the moment. But when we talk about alcohol, for example, right, the Middle East, they typically don't drink a lot of alcohol, and they don't allow alcohol in meetings or at dinners, etc. But now, as the book said, because they do so much business with the West, they're getting more and more used to having alcohol involved. But that's definitely considered a mores, that we need to understand that there are norms that are central to the true everyday functioning of society. Okay, so now let's talk about society, how it reflects people who are bound together by a common culture. Nation states are political creations that can contain a single culture or several cultures. So here they talk about French Canada, right? This is the nation state, the Quebecois, but they have the French people, but then they also have the people who are native to Canada. Then they have the people who are the modern day Canadians. And so, right, lots of different people who can live in one particular nation state. Some cultures also embrace several nations. This is that example of either Chinese, right? Chinese culture extends to Taiwan and a handful of different countries in Asia. Also, the Scandinavian model or Scandinavian idea that if you talk to someone from Finland or from Sweden or from Norway, they very often have very similar values and similar cultures. And then it's also possible to talk about culture at different levels within society. And this is where we talk about like maybe the America, where we have like the Cajun people from New Orleans, we have African Americans, right? We have Chinese Americans, we have Japanese Americans, etc., Swiss Americans, and lots of different people who operate within these different levels within society, within one society. And now we're just finishing up this first part of chapter 4, determinants of culture. And values and norms of a culture evolve. How do we get these values and norms? They are based on prevailing political economic philosophies, society, social structure, and a dominant religion, language, and education. And so I feel like those are pretty straightforward. I won't describe those even further, but the idea, right, very much based on how we speak, how we learn, and the religion that we might practice. Here's a really nice figure talking about the determinants of culture, right? The norms and the value systems here in the middle. And as you can see, right, we have religion, political philosophy, economic philosophy, education, language, and social structure. So thank you for joining me for part 1 of chapter 4. I will lead part 2 in the next video.